5090 review time. It's finally time to talk about everything without any limitations when it comes to the RTX 5090 from NVIDIA. The newest flagship, insanely expensive graphics card, but something's missing. Okay, that's better, but something's still missing. That's better, but something is still missing. Yeah, that feels about right, but it's still not quite enough to buy one. Today's video is brought to you by the new, really super cool JSUSense Melty connector shirt, paying tribute to one of the best designs that's clearly ever existed. And if you don't like the Vaporwave colors, we've got our OG gray and red colors available now. So get yours by following the link in the description below.
Nice.
Ow, I have a thigh cramp. Okay, RTX 5090. This is the first time we've actually used most of the, well, pretty much all of the new techniques and methodology that we're doing to test our GPUs. I don't ask much. I do ask that you give this video a like if you appreciate it. I've probably put more than 50 hours into this one review alone. That's more than we've ever put into a GPU review, but I think the data is solid. I think the information we're gonna show you is relevant, and I'm really excited for this video because it really showcases strengths and weaknesses that we may not have been able to find in the past. Anyway, the things we're gonna focus on today: performance, power draw, temperature, form factor, cost of performance uplift, performance per dollar, all of that sort of stuff. So we'll talk about some of the key features. Obviously, it's the NVIDIA Blackwell architecture. It's the GB202 TSMC 4nm process, 21,760 CUDA cores. That's just an astronomical number. I don't think we've never talked about a GPU that has had that many cores. In fact, the most cores we've talked about in the past was the 4090, which had over 16,000. Anyway, 680 TMUs, 192 ROPS, 32 gigabytes of GDDR7 at 28 gigabits per second effective speed. That's obviously an uplift from the 24 gigabytes found on the RTX 4090 and the RTX 3090. So 32 gigabytes. It is a true PCIe Gen 5 device. In fact, it is such a true PCIe Gen 5 device that my PCIe riser that we use from Elmore Labs to measure socket power doesn't work with the device. In fact, it crashes the device. So yeah, the new testing methodology for power now is going to be relying on a hardware update. Hopefully that comes in the future. Anyway, it also features an illuminated X on both sides of the card, where the 4090 and 3090 featured only half the X on one side of the card, and then an illuminated logo that says GeForce RTX. Can't find any sort of control for the LEDs on the card yet. The 3090 actually was an RGB card. You could actually change it from white to any other color within the RGB spectrum. OpenRGB doesn't really recognize the card. No other software seems to control it. That might change in the future. I don't know if it's a true RGB, but whatever, that's just there. So thermal design is a 575 watt total board power card. That is insane, especially coming off of the heels of a lot of the concerns and the ongoing, every now and then popping up melting connector that you would find with the 12 volt high power, now known as 12 volt 2x6, because of the fact that there have been some revisions to that. In fact, we've talked about that in previous videos, that the connector was slightly changed, the pins were slightly changed. We showed in our unboxing that there actually was an improvement to the adapter itself. It's got some actual shielding and armor on it to keep it from bending too tight, to pull itself out. Its flexibility now means that you can have more mounting options in cases where the side panel might have impacted the cable. It actually has more bend to it. That's also aided by the fact that the 5090 features an angled power plug to give you more clearance and an easier way to, my Gen Sun is hitting everything right now. Anyway, it gives you better routing options when it comes to the cable. Apparently I am bleeding. I have now bled on my paper. How? But yeah, the 575 watt max TDP, when it comes to overclocking, we'll talk about that in a separate video. This one's gonna be long enough already with just the out of the box type of performance. But just kind of a high level, you do get 4% of additional power limit. You can go from 100 at 575 to 104%, which actually works out to just under 600 watts. Now, we do have a power draw section of this video. You'll see it actually does spike quite a bit above 575 depending on the workload. It's recommended a 1000 watt PSU. Higher than that might actually be recommended, to be honest, because I was seeing total system power exceeding 800 watts in certain workloads with this card. On a 9800 X3D, which is our test bench, if you're running a high core count CPU or something more power hungry like an Intel CPU, pulling 253 plus watts depending on your board and your configuration. You can easily hit that 1,000 watt limit and maybe run into some OCP or overcurrent protections, shutting down your system depending on your workloads. So 1,200 watt might be really the more optimal power supply for that. At the very least, if you're running 1,000 watt, make sure it's a high rated power supply, something that's got, solid capacitors, something that's either running a high 80 plus rating or even a cybernetics rating to make sure that you're getting, all of the power that you're gonna need for this. When it comes to the dimensions though, it is 304 millimeters long, it is 137 millimeters tall, and 48 millimeters thick. It's obviously a 2-slot design, a true 2-slot design, we already talked about that. Overall exterior dimensions matches 3090 and 4090, it's just not a 3-slot or a 3.2 slot card. So there's a lot of discussion about it being so small. It's really not that small, it's actually just that much narrower, really. That's because it also does feature a blow-through design, a 3D vapor chamber with liquid metal for cooling the die. But it is a flow-through design, which means the PCB is in the middle. It's a 3-part PCB. The output is a connected component to the PCB, and the PCI Express the PCI Express slot is also a separate PCB from the main board. So there's 3 pieces to it. Flow-through design. Very low impedance when it comes to the fin stack. It is a tighter fin stack at only 1.6 millimeters of gap between them, which means it's a tighter fin array than on the 4090. Doesn't make any crazy turns. That also has this concave in the middle that's reducing the amount of resistance across where the pressure drops are and aren't based on the fan design. So it's actually a really neat, very well thought out cooler, given the fact that they're reducing the slot thickness. They definitely had to make sure that their efficiency was there. Let's talk about weight real quick. It is actually lighter than the 4090, even though it feels heavier to the hand because it's denser. It weighs in at 1,836 grams. The 4090, by comparison, 2,178 grams. So it is a lighter GPU overall, and in my opinion, it looks nicer with the darker gunmetal color versus the more bronzy color that you find on the 40 series and 30 series, minus the 4080 Super, which is actually black. Let's go ahead and talk about our test rig. So it's a 9800 X3D, overclocked to 5.3 gigahertz, locked, does not fluctuate. The GPU does not go, or the CPU does not go up and down based on GPU load. It is just locked. We're running the G.Skill, 32 gigabytes of G.Skill 6000 megahertz CL2836 gaming RAM on an X870E Taichi ASRock motherboard. Now, all of our tests are a 3-run average. We are including not only average FPS, we are including 99th percentile and 95th percentile. So the way that you need to look at these charts and realize the way 99 and 95 works, because you're probably used to seeing 1 and 0.1%. 99th percentile means 99% of the frames are that FPS or better. The 95th percentile means 95% of the frames are that FPS or better. So it gives you a real better look at what the overall performance of the card is going to look like and what the dips and lows are on average. Fun fact and spoiler alert, it does really, really well. So here's what we're going to do. We ran 9 different titles at 3 different resolutions, and there are way too many charts to sit here and go over each one. We're just going to run through them right now. We're going to put them on the screen, only put them up for a couple of seconds. Pause the ones that are most interesting to you. It is an entirely new testing suite for us. The only title that's not a synthetic that is held over from previous testing is Borderlands 3. Everything else for us is a brand new title and a lot more modern and a lot more relevant. So let's run the benchmarks. Now, obviously, if you're running 1080p, it's going to be pretty easy to start running into CPU bottlenecks. I would not say this is a very solid 1080p card unless you're running a title that absolutely positively must have the most FPS no matter what. I guess some esports titles are that way. I don't run any of those titles, so I really couldn't answer or speak to the needs of that. But this is a 4K card and a 4K card alone as far as I'm concerned, even though we tested 1080p in 1440. So obviously in 1080p, the lead over the RTX 4090 is smaller than the lead in 4K. Also too, all of our tests pretty much ran non-frame gen and only small amounts of DLSS. I wanted to see what the true horsepower uplift is between the 4090 and the 5090. Now, the median uplift in raw performance is 32.4% across our testing in 4K. I only did median uplift in 4K. 1440 and 1080p have too much opportunity for CPU bound to rear its ugly head. So if we're looking at 4K, ultra settings across the board to see what kind of uplift we were getting by being as GPU bound as possible, yeah, 32.4%. Let's talk about that for a second. So historically, GPU uplift, same tier to same tier when it comes to generation versus generation with NVIDIA, is typically about 25%. Now that might seem like, oh, hey, they threw a bone and are giving us, at least in Jay's tests, and these are obviously going to vary. Some of the tests were in the low 40% uplift. Some of them were in the mid to low 20% uplift, depending on the title and its efficiency when it comes to the engine to leverage the horsepower that the graphics card can provide. So our median is 32.4. If we take into consideration the uplift between 3090 and 4090, that was 81% in our tests at the same cost. Don't forget the 5090 does come in at $1,999 MSRP for the Founders Edition. You can pretty much guarantee every single AIB card is going to cost more than that, which means your uplift and performance uplift per dollar, which we'll talk about that calculation in a second, performance per dollar is going to look even worse than what we're about to show you right now. But the 3090 was $1,599 and the 4090 was $1,599. Founders Edition cards, yes, obviously the price really fluctuated a lot throughout its life cycle over the last two years, or slightly over 2 years. So it's 25% more expensive than the 4090 to give you 32.4% more performance, which actually works out to only 5.91% more performance per dollar. Compared to the 81% additional more performance per dollar because there was zero cost change from 3090 to 4090, it is not the greatest value proposition, at least for gamers. There is use cases for this card outside of gaming. We'll talk about those in a moment. But 4090 was one of those cards that a lot of people were just like, this is ridiculous, it's so expensive, why does it exist? But when you really compared it generationally between 3090 and 4090, you got nearly double the performance at the same cost. That does not exist with the 5090. Now, obviously, this is costing a lot to manufacture. They've relied heavily on software / hardware improvements that take place on an AI upscaler / multi-frame gen to really showcase what they're looking at doing in the future. So once again, this is a card that is kind of like the first in what the future tends to look like. And I think a lot of gamers right now are really kind of upset about that because this is where the whole discussion of fake frames versus real frames come in. Now, we did real frames in all of our testing here. I did run one test of Cyberpunk 2077 where we turned on multi-frame gen and we ran it with 2x, 3x, and 4x. And when you and we obviously ran the 4090 with frame gen turned on. Remember, 4090 does not get multi-frame gen. That is a hardware level feature that exists only on 50 series. So frame gen exists obviously on the 40 series, but it is only one AI interpolated frame where you can add 1, 2, or 3 interpolated frames on top of the rendered frame with the 50 series card. So if you look at this chart, you can see it jumps out and then jumps out by a factor of 1 and then by another factor of 1. It's pretty much doubling the frame rate every time. Well, it's adding that initial rendered frame again every time you increase the frame gen from 2x, 3x, 4x. What I want to point out on this chart though is you got to take our 5% and 1% low, or 95% and 99% with a grain of salt. I'm waiting for a discussion with Intel regarding PresentMon because what we're seeing here, it appears to be showing the 95th percentile and 99th percentiles based on the truly rendered frame by the game engine, not by the card. So that chart's kind of showing two different things. It's showing the average frame rate based on the rendered frame, as well as the interpolated frames for your output visual frame, but it's showing the 1% and 5% lows as only the rendered frame, which the game engine's doing, not the GPU. So I'm waiting to have a discussion with Intel about how to make that data more accurate in terms, because that might say, wow, you're getting 291 or 201 FPS, but then you're getting 46 FPS as a low, but that's not what it actually felt like or looked like. So I think that's just a reporting error when it comes to the software. One thing I want to talk about though, when you turn on frame gen, you get increased latency. The reason being for that is the only movement that's happening in the game engine is based on the rendered frame. The interpolated frames are not taken into account input, WASD, spacebar, mouse, and all of that. Only the rendered frame, And then you've got the inserted frames before the next rendered frame where it takes that input and then draws it. NVIDIA Reflex is turned on by default when you turn on frame gen. So it's improved, and they have made improvements to that. The one thing I cannot really display for you or show you because I'm not equipped to is the actual latency between click to drawn frame or click to photon, whatever you want to call it. I can tell you, I cannot relate to you a feeling, but the feeling of the frame rate is still going to feel like the base frame rate. So for instance, in Cyberpunk 2077, the base frame rate before turning on frame gen is 60.2 FPS. Even though we are getting a displayed frame rate of 201, the input is gonna feel like you're still at 60 FPS. So you're gonna get what feels like kind of a jello-y, a slightly jello-y feel to it. It's not, this is where we're very subjective at this point of the video. Both Phil and I agree it's playable, it's not terrible, it's better than what it felt like on 40 series. However, it's still there, it's still noticeable. If you were playing a title like Rocket League, let's say Rocket League had multi-frame gen, that would be terrible because every frame matters in a game like Rocket League. Every frame matters in a competitive title. So single player games, I don't know, Star Wars Outlaws, Cyberpunk, Control, Indiana Jones, these games are games that I would be able to turn on multi-frame gen and not feel like I'm at a disadvantage or I'm at some sort of a handicap when it comes to input latency. But competitive titles, I would absolutely, personally, not run it. So that's why I was very adamant that I'm showing raw performance when it comes to our testing, including RT on, without even running DLSS in most titles. Some of the titles I was running DLSS at a 66% base resolution. But once you turn on the multi-frame gen, yeah, it is very smooth on screen. But seeing things move on screen and then seeing them react to your input are two very different things. That is why people are upset. That is why people are calling these fake frames, because the game is not rendering the frame, the GPU is doing it after the fact. So important to point that out. That's all I'm going to talk about with frame gen. That's all I was prepared to talk about today when it comes to frame gen. It's going to be a bigger discussion in the future. That is the way NVIDIA is going. If you don't buy into that, then 40 series, even though it has frame gen, it's kind of your last stand before you're forced into it moving forward. It's kind of like RT now. RT, when it first came out, everyone was like, it's a gimmick, no one cares. Now every title supports RT. One thing I want to point out though, well, almost every title. One thing I want to point out though is, right now at the time of testing, only about 5 or 6 titles support multi-frame gen natively in the game engine itself. There are 75 titles that NVIDIA is going to say are available that support multi-frame gen at launch, but just about 70 of those are relying on the NVIDIA app to override and do it on a driver level rather than a game level. We didn't test any of that. I'm not prepared to. I need more time to get comfortable with that before we can determine whether or not there's any sort of weirdness that takes place when the driver's handling multi-frame gen versus the game engine. I think personally, the game engine handling it would be a better experience, but obviously this is kind of like a band-aid to sort of bridge the gap between multi-gen being the future with AI interpolated frames from NVIDIA before game developers can implement it at a coding level. So I guess we'll have to wait and see what the future holds there. Now, DLSS 4 isn't only about multi-frame gen. Actually, 40, 30, and 20 series are going to be getting DLSS 4 as well. It's just they're not going to be getting multi-frame gen. So 40 series will still have frame gen. 30 series and 20 series will have no frame gen because, again, that was a hardware level generation issue, just like multi-frame gen is a hardware level thing for 50 series. But the 40, 30, and 20 series will get all the fidelity improvements when it comes to the transformer model instead of the convolutional neural network model when it comes to the AI upscaler now to the transformative model, which is actually the same thing ChatGPT uses now to generate its images and stuff. So it's actually doing a better job now at sharpening up the image, denoising. There's less smudges and less traces of, distant text doesn't look as fuzzy anymore. It's still not perfect. It's still going to have some trails left behind when it comes to NPCs or cars moving in the distance. 40 series, 30 series, and 20 series are getting the new transformative model built into DLSS, but only 50 series gets the multi-gen aspect of that. So the discussions of, yeah, DLSS looks terrible, whatever, it's improving. It's still not perfect, but it is improving. I just wanted to point that out because someone did actually request that we talk about how terrible DLSS looks. I don't know, I think DLSS looks way better than, I remember day one and how DLSS looked. It just kind of looked like you were looking through a film grain in a movie, and anytime you moved, it was all sparkly, it was terrible. But it has improved, and we'll see how it moves forward now on the transformative model versus the convolutional neural network. All right, so let's talk about frequencies real quick. So the base clock is actually 2017 megahertz, which sounds very low, and a boost clock of 2407. Now, because of GPU boost algorithms, it'll go much higher than that. Actually, we saw in gaming an average of about 2650 megahertz when it comes to the frequency under gaming loads. But we tested it with a couple of different scenarios. So I used Stalker 2 at 4K with epic settings. I'm trying to push it as hard as I possibly can. Stock fan profile. If you look at this chart right here, you can see it's at about 2650 megahertz, averaging over 2600, which means we're getting nearly 200 megahertz additional boost clock over what's advertised, just simply because of cooling headroom, power headroom, etc. But if you look at the pink line on here, that's actually FurMark. FurMark is a very difficult test to run. In fact, it's been known to actually damage cards in the past that weren't capable of throttling themselves well enough as they're trying to render all the fuzzy donut that's going around and around in circles. And the reason why it's so fluctuating like that on the chart is because of the fact that the donut is turning and there's different parts that are harder to render than others. So it's a pretty stressful test. But you can see the test started out at about 2200 megahertz and dropped down as low as 2000, bouncing between 2000 and 2100. Now, a little caveat to mention with that though, a lot of GPU manufacturers know that FurMark is notorious for being very difficult to run on cards. So more often than not, there might be logic built into the GPU or the driver that says, if running FurMark, downclock. It's kind of like when running Cinebench, some motherboards and CPUs will automatically run like an AVX offset to reduce the frequency in the CPU because of the difficulty to run the test. It's designed to keep things from getting too hot, too out of control, or causing any potential damage. So I just wanted to point that out. The load does kind of jump around, but in games, across pretty much all of our games, we saw 2600 megahertz on average and above when it comes to the game clock. So that's a testament to how well the cooler is actually performing. All right, so testing conditions for temperature, now that we sort of talked about that. Our room temp is 22°C, very temperature controlled, or about 72 degrees Fahrenheit. You can see on our test bench, it is an open air test bench, on an open bench table is what it's called. So the only thing impacting temperatures is the cooler itself. It also is in a vertical orientation in our test bench, not a horizontal. But if you watch the interview Steven at Gamers Nexus did with Malcolm from NVIDIA, which is the thermal engineer and cooler engineer, they test it in all orientations. And because it's a 3D vapor chamber, it really doesn't matter what orientation you put it in. But ours was in a vertical orientation, which is worth pointing out. Anyway, the stock fan curve does have a 0 dB mode. So at idle, it'll run about 32 to 35 C, depending on your ambient temperature with the fans off. The max percentage I saw our GPU fan curve get to in our open test bench is 48%, which capped our temperatures at 77 C. And once again, it's important to point out that these temperatures were tested in FurMark, because in my opinion, these are gonna be the worst, almost the worst conditions they could possibly experience when it comes to load. But 77 C was also the highest I was seeing in any of our game benchmarks. All of our tests are recorded, and every single one of them have data that we can go and reference. It is pretty solid that 77 C was about the hottest that we saw it get to in an open air chassis. Fun fact, in the small little case that we did a build in, we saw it get up to 80. We'll talk about that in a separate video. I told you we'll do that, but there's some testing we have to do to figure out the configuration where it runs the best. But right now, it'll get up to 80 C, which is only 3 C hotter than the open air test bench, but that also required much higher fan curve. So we'll talk about that in a separate video. But if I apply an MSI afterburner fan curve, by looking at this chart right here, which has all three here, including 100% fan curve, it drops all the way down to 73 C average with 71 low, and then 100% fan speed, 64 C is our max with an average of 62.5. So at 100% fan speed, which is an additional 52% fan speed over what the stock fan curve was at 48, you can see drops it all the way from 77 down to 62, or 15 C average drop. That is huge. Obviously, the NVIDIA fan curve is favoring acoustics and noise over the temperatures itself. Now, that's a pretty far cry from the 90 C max temperature that the GPU is allowed, even with the higher fan curve and in a small chassis. 80 is not terrible. So you're gonna wanna make sure though that your chassis is capable of exhausting all the heat. Let's talk about why. The previous design And this is gonna be very similar to if you're running like any sort of the AIBs with like triple fans or now 4 fans or whatever. Every single bit of the air, 100% of the heat is being exhausted into the chassis. When you take a look at the asymmetrical design of the previous gens, half the card was a flow through, half the card exhausts its own heat. So now every single bit of the heat needs to be exhausted by the case. So you need to make sure that your case cooling and airflow exchange rate is adequate enough for this, or your temperatures are obviously going to be significantly higher. In an open air test bench, we do it this way. That way we can say exactly what the cooler's limitations are, not what the case limitations are. There's no case I could test this in that would be significant or relevant enough to everyone to say, this is the one that matches most people's scenario. So we test open test bench only. But when it comes to noise though, the fan blade design, the double flow through, the fact that you're not hearing the turbulent air change, direction change, it's actually much more pleasant on the ear. But what I want you guys to hear is the difference in not volume, but the pitch. Pitch and the acoustic nature of sound is more important than the volume of the sound when it comes to something like this. And we find that the fan blades and the sound of the air going through the 5090 is much smoother and much less intrusive than what we find on the 4090. So I'm gonna lock the fan speeds right now at 65% and let you hear an A/B between the way that the cooler fins, blades, and fan arrangement sounds between both of these. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about power draw. That's an interesting one. I already explained that I wasn't able to use our riser to capture whatever power is going through the socket. Some is going through the socket. How much? I can't actually tell you. The card legitimately would not run with this on there. In fact, it was so bad, the system was actually hanging even just at the desktop. So what you're looking at here is our power draw chart from Furmark, again at 4K. This is a 10-minute test, and you can see 2 lines on here. The pink line, which is just a solid 575 watt line, is what the card itself is reporting back as to what it's using. That's software measurement. However, using our PMD2 device and actually measuring the power going through the cable itself, you can see it's a lot more fluctuating than that, and you can even see a few spikes on there that are significantly higher than the 575 watt TDP limit. If we zoom in on the chart, you can see most of the blue line, which is the PMD measurement, measuring the 12 volt high power itself, resides above the 575 watt TDP line. So this is why it's important now that we use hardware monitoring when it comes to power test rather than what is reported, because the GPU only reports 575 if it gets that high. In game test, however, it uses significantly less, around 500 to 520 watts. Now, it's weird to say that's less, because remember the 4090 was a 450 watt card. And we know what happened to the 12 volt high power cable with that one. Speaking of the 12 volt high power cable, I need to point out, and it's impossible to demonstrate this for you to be able to feel it, the insertion force, or how tight the plug is in the 5090, is significantly improved over the 40 series. The 40 series, I always talked about, it had too much wiggle and too much flexibility and movement, which could lead to a situation where the cable starts to back out slightly, you make poor contact, and that was often what was leading to the melting connector issues with 4090s. This is significantly tighter. Like, I want to enter a very derogatory reference to give you an idea of just how tight it is. You can fill in the blanks, but when I had Phil insert it for me, his exact response was, holy fuck. In fact, Phil went to put it in with one hand, and it actually required 2 hands. This is just a friend. Okay, don't forget, this is just a friend. Use this cable. Plug that into the 5090.
Oh, okay. Am I gonna break it?
No.
Okay.
That's what she said.
This is actually pretty hard. This is quite difficult, but I didn't hear it snap in. Is it in?
Yeah, it's in.
Okay.
So, that scientific test has now been demonstrated. Now, one thing I want to point out is it's not just the cable. Taking our 12 volt high power that is from our Corsair power supply has the same level of insertion force. So I think the actual female end itself has become tighter. All right, I'm gonna get off this section here before I get myself demonetized. Moving on. So strengths of the GPU, I mean, it's extremely powerful. The raw performance is there. It's not nearly as much of a generational jump as we talked about between 3090 and 4090. That was 80+% uplift in performance at the same cost. This is 32.4% more uplift in my tests at 25% more cost, giving 5.91% performance per dollar increase, which is, I mean, at that point, if the performance per dollar is nearly that similar, your 4090 is giving you the same, it's only giving you what, 94.9% less performance at cost per dollar. So it's not really like you should be running out and updating to an RTX 5090 if you have a 4090. I don't think this is really intended for someone with a 4090. I think it's intended for someone that needs the high frame pool buffer to do AI workloads or development or AI development. If you look at it, it's really kind of replaced the Quattro series. The Quattro series hasn't been updated in a long time because the consumer cards are now starting to really move forward into this whole kind of a new prosumer type of line that's just falling under the GeForce name. But this card is more than just a gaming card. It is intended for people that can utilize its raw horsepower, high memory pool for those types of workloads. And oh yeah, it's pretty good at gaming too. Like that's really what this card is meant for. The 5080, that is the gamer card as far as we're concerned. This is the, I have to have the best at all costs, at all diminished returns. I don't care. I've got deep pockets. You're gonna buy it anyway. What I'm saying doesn't matter. You've already decided you're gonna buy it. But that's who this card really is intended for. I mean, it's also intended for everyone to put into their $10,000 computer, right? I mean, everyone has a $10,000 computer with a $2,000 graphics card in there, right?
Look, it's $1,599. It is one of the best investments you could possibly make. You bring it home to your $10,000 PC entertainment command center. Isn't that right? Don't tell me that's not true. Don't be ashamed.
In fact, in all seriousness, if you really watched the keynote, you would realize the 5090 was only ever compared to the other cards when it came to AI tops. I mean, it's just, that's the only type of workload they're even measuring anymore to determine. You know how like ROPS was the thing everyone measured back in the, now TOPS is the newest thing, apparently. Like I said, it's an excellent card for professionals too, that also, and content creators that could use the very high frame buffer. I mean, if you do 3D rendering, like actual 3D modeling and stuff, this would be an amazing card. I've seen a lot of people online say, I'm buying it simply because I need it for work. And I think given what the Quattro cards cost a few generations ago, $5,000, $6,000, this would destroy those cards in pretty much all of these types of workflows. Not all of them. I mean, they still hold some things back for the, obviously for the consumer cards, but it is definitely a huge improvement for people that could use it in those type of workflows and scenarios. I mean, it's just not a gamer card as far as we're concerned. It runs cooler than expected. It runs hotter than a 4090, but it's 125 watt higher TDP. It's expected to. It runs warmer and it's narrower, but again, 21,760 CUDA cores versus 16,384. I mean, obviously, it's going to run warmer, right? Those are a lot of cores to do things. The two-slot design and the power plug make it more compatible with other cases and such. Weaknesses, expensive. Like I said, I'm not even wearing enough money right now to buy one. Partner models are guaranteed to be more. Probably going to be in the $2,500 range and above, maybe. I mean, the Astro card from Asus, who knows what that's going to cost, but it's going to have an astronomical price tag with it, I'm sure. Does anybody else miss the day when like $50 to $75 was what the custom high-end card cost was over MSRP? Man, I miss the old days. Anyway, it's got a huge power draw. 1,000 watt power supply is the requirement. That, like I already said, with me running a 9800X3D, which is not a very power-hungry CPU, I was seeing up to 800 watts power draw for the entire system when it comes to the PMD. And that's not even accounting for whatever the PCI Express slot was actually pulled. I guess it's accounted for in the 24 pin, but I digress. Yeah, 800 watts in gaming. That was crazy. So a 1200 watt power supply really is going to be the recommendation, and obviously a high rated 1200 watt power supply, so you have a better quality internals, so it will definitely last longer. Other downsides, depending on your case flow design, it can run pretty warm. Like I said, your case is 100% responsible for exhausting the air from this card. That's not really a huge talking point though. That's true for every card other than the Founders Edition card, just about every other card, and 40 series and below Founders cards, I mean. Just about every single AIB card is going to require that all the air be exhausted by the case too. So your case choice is going to matter. As somebody that is a PC enthusiast, I'm a PC building enthusiast. I'm one of those people that fall under the, like, I want the best. Anyone watching this video would want a 5090. doesn't mean you find the value in it at $2,000. Maybe if it was like 500 bucks, I mean, yeah, then who the heck wouldn't want to buy it, right? Everyone wants the performance, but the other side of the coin is how much does it cost? It's not necessarily the best value proposition for gamers. That's why I said the 5080 is more the card that should interest you when it comes to gaming. So that's why it's kind of an easy pass when it comes to gamers. It's just not worth it. I mean, depending on what you're doing and what kind of games you're playing, you might need the card. You know, it's a really good card. Like, it's the best card. You absolutely should maybe buy it. Okay, buy the card, all right? Just buy the freaking card already. This is still not enough to buy it. Ow.